Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPod Touch 7th generation and see how this specific iPod holds up in 2023. Now, of course, this iPod is probably not worth buying anymore, but it was the last iPod that Apple has ever made. So looking back, it's honestly a very interesting thing that Apple made back in 2019. It was kind of random. I don't really know too many people who were even planning on buying an iPod, even past 2016, but especially in 2019 for Apple to kind of refresh it, I think it was kind of cool. It kind of put the last hurrah in the iPod lineup. But of course, I don't think this thing is worth buying anymore. I think the last time Apple was selling this, it actually got discontinued last year. So this is the first year we are going without Apple selling a brand new iPod. Now, I think when the last iPod was being sold, I think it was like $100 and something. It may be $200, but it was probably $180, something along those lines. So it wasn't a super expensive device. So I think that's kind of one of those things to keep in mind. You weren't spending a crazy amount of money on this thing back in, 2020 or 2019 when this thing came out. But even in 2019, this type of iPod was almost the same exact thing as an iPhone 7 internally. So because of that, you are much, much better off buying something like an iPhone 7 rather than an iPod Touch 7, because the iPhone 7 is going to be cheaper, it's going to be giving you a better camera, and it's probably going to be giving you better performance, especially if you go for the iPhone 7 Plus, and any iPhone above that is going to be better than this iPod. So that is kind of how this iPod has kind of, broken down for me personally in the last year or so for, since this iPod's been, unreleased. Now, on the front, this iPod does have that very, very unique design. So ever since the iPod Touch first generation, you've seen that Apple's kind of done the same exact thing year after year after year. Now, I think with the iPod Touch 5th generation, they did change up the styling. And since then, for the iPod 5, 6, and 7, they've kept the same exact design on the outside. So they haven't really changed the outside at all, which is totally expected and that's totally fine. So on the front of this display, you have a 4-inch Retina display. So it definitely isn't shocking anybody nowadays. It's a pretty basic panel when it comes down to it. But I will say for an iPod, this was, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. And I do think it's kind of okay. You have the front-facing camera. You have the, just standard home button on the front. No fingerprint sensor or Touch ID on this thing at all. But still, I think the front of this thing looks pretty iconic. It definitely doesn't look that good anymore, but it looks nice. It still looks like a pretty good iPod. It's pretty surprising. Of course, the bezels on this thing are massive, but, a lot of people would know this, but you're not buying this iPod because it looks good. You're probably buying it for your grandkid or your kid because, or whatever, because you don't want to spend that much money on an iPhone, and probably they don't need a SIM card and all that stuff. So that's probably why you're going down the iPod route in the first place. Now on the bottom, you have your Lightning port, which is great. You have your headphone jack on this iPod as well, which is always nice to have. And it's weird they were still making the headphone on the iPod Touch 7, even when iPhones did not have headphone jacks. So that was honestly kind of interesting. And on the back, you had your standard aluminum back. You had your single camera setup on the top left. And when I look at this iPod, it is very crazy because this thing is so small, it is so slim, and for it to even be as powerful as an iPhone 7 is pretty surprising because it is in such a small form factor. Now, I don't really think people were buying this iPod even when it first came out, but one of the things that people kind of stated as to why this may be a good thing that Apple were to do was because this was the cheapest way of kind of getting into the Apple ecosystem in the brand new market. So instead of somebody buying a used iPhone or somebody buying some sort of iPhone SE at that time, well, you could buy an iPod Touch 7 for less than $200 at that time probably. And you could be able to, if you were a developer, you could go ahead and develop out games and applications and test them on something like an iPod Touch 7, even though you could emulate them on your own computer. You could test them on your iPod Touch 7 and you'd be able to utilize your iPod that way, and you'd be able to test out your apps and games and all that stuff. And that was kind of a cool thing and a cool idea, and I've heard a lot of people actually mention that they did that. But nowadays, like I said, you can buy an iPhone 7 for $50, and if you want a broken one, you can even buy one for less than that if it has a bad IMEI number. So these things, it just doesn't really make too much sense to buy an iPod Touch 7 anymore. Now with the camera side of things, like I mentioned, it had that 8 megapixel camera on the back. I think it had a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front. It really was not that great of a camera. Even when it first came out, it probably wasn't even that great. The thing is that for a majority of people who were buying something like this iPod Touch 7, you weren't really buying it because it was the best camera or because it could handle the camera that you want or whatever the case is. The thing with this camera was that you were buying it because it was already on your iPod. So with an iPod Touch 7, you're definitely not going to be getting that great of an experience on the camera side. You could film 1080p videos on the back. I think you could do 720p videos on the front. So very, very average camera. Like this thing is not going to be competing with any type of, even the iPhone 7 was better than this thing. But I say that to say, even with something like the iPod Touch 7, I kind of do think that Apple kind of did an okay job. You know, the fact that this thing even has a camera on it is pretty good in my understanding. So take it as you will, but this thing is definitely not outcompeting anybody. It's an okay camera at best nowadays. Now, from the software side of things, this is also something that changed drastically within the last year. So with the iPod Touch 7, what ended up happening was this specific device pretty much got unsupported with software last year. So it was kind of short because it started in 2019 and it ended off in 2022. So it only got about like 3 years of software, which is kind of interesting. But again, this thing had the same chipset as the iPhone 7. The iPhone 7 got discontinued as well, so it was kind of expected. And then that kind of showcased the ending of the iPod Touch lineup. I think we got a little message right before the WWDC stating that the iPod Touch 7 was going to be the last iPod or something like that. And I guess I kind of didn't put that in perspective. And then all of those iPhones, including the 6S, the 7, 7 Plus, so on and so forth, all those iPhones got discontinued, including the iPod Touch 7. So that was a pretty insane thing. But as of this point, the iPod Touch 7 is discontinued. There is no longer an iPod Touch or any iPod that is supported with software right now. So it's a pretty sad thing. It's kind of the end of that lineup, but that's kind of how this iPod held up in the software standpoint. Now, in the performance side, this specific iPad is actually kind of interesting. For the 10th time I've mentioned this video now, it does have the same chipset as the iPhone 7. So that is kind of an important thing to keep in mind. The internals were almost identical to the iPhone 7. The 7 Plus did have more RAM, so keep that in mind. But with the iPod Touch, 5th, 7th generation that we're talking about, this is honestly not that bad of a performing iPod. Of course, if you're trying to play very intensive games or you're trying to compare it against the iPhone 14 Pro, that's not going to be the case at all. But with something like the iPod Touch 7, what's very interesting is that this thing actually kind of will do a better job than what you're expecting. So those things always kind of, stand out to me. And I definitely do think with something like the iPod Touch 7, I kind of do think that this thing may not be the first phone I would recommend or the first thing I would recommend, but this is a very okay performing iPod for how old this iPod is. So, again, if you're trying to play Genshin Impact, this could probably handle it. But very soon, in the next few years, this iPod isn't even going to be supported with software, or it's not going to be supported with applications. And it just doesn't make any sense to recommend this iPod at all, considering even if you want something cheap and, kind of performance kind of okay, the iPhone 8 would be better than this thing. The iPhone XR you can probably buy for even if you bought a bad IMEI iPhone XR or an iPhone XR with a cracked back or something, those can run you maybe $100 and something, and it would be a way better deal than this thing because, that thing, even if the SIM card doesn't work, this one doesn't even have a SIM card in it. So take that as you will. And to kind of sum up the video, I'll definitely be honest, I kind of do think that the iPod Touch 7 really isn't worth buying. Even when it first came out, it really wasn't worth buying. But especially now, it makes zero sense to buy something like this. It makes way more sense to go and buy something like an iPhone 7, an iPhone 8, if you want to go down this direction of even buying an iPod. But for basically everyone out there, I wouldn't even really recommend buying an iPod. I would just recommend going for, using your iPhone as you normally would. That would make a lot more sense. And that's kind of what I would recommend doing in that specific standpoint. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.